Hey, what's up guys? I'm going to be starting up a new series in which we are going to be developing a complete project in Next.js. This is going to be a hands-on course and you can actually follow along with me. In this course, we're going to be basically developing a movie booking kind of application. So we have a lot of websites available around the globe. So for example, there's one site called Vox on which you can basically book movies. Then you also have another site called as Signopolis in which you can again book the movies. The presentation style is different, but the concept is pretty much the same, in which you list all the movies. You can select the region where you want to be booking the movie. You have a detail screen on which you can be viewing the kind of movies detail, and you also have the option of selecting any of the theaters. So same kind of format is followed pretty much across all the websites. So this is another website called Book My Show, in which you can again select some sort of movies. It gives you a detail about the movie. This one even gives you the cast of that movie, and you have some of the reviews and so on. So we're going to be trying to develop something like this in Next.js, and let's get started. So So I'm going to be first giving you a walkthrough about what is Next.js. I'm assuming that you have not worked on Next.js, and this is just going to be setting up all the code repository and you can just follow along with me. Now, just to give you an introduction first, I've just made up a small diagram which I would like to share you in case you have not really worked with Next.js, but you have worked with the traditional React.js application. Let's try to understand what's the difference between those. So one of the reasons why Next.js is very popular is because of the server-side rendering. Now, traditionally, if you worked in a React.js application which you are not utilizing the server-side capabilities, in which in that case your architecture would look something like this. So you would have like a traditional application running on a React server. You're going to be passing in the JS, CSS, and the HTML, probably all compiled using Vite or maybe Webpack, and serving all those files to your browser. Your browser might also be sending some request to your API server, which is basically behaving as your backend server, through which you might be making some database calls. You might be sending some other calls to external services and so on. So this was the traditional kind of approach in which you have deployed all the React applications. Now, generally, when you want to be doing some sort of routing, it used to happen all on the client side. We used to just request all of this content once, and whenever you're doing any of the route changes, everything happens on the browser, and there's a client side rendering happening here, and all the routing happens on the client side as well. So this was the traditional React application. Then came Next.js. So in Next.js, they were like, hey, no need to do all of this stuff. You're going to be rendering everything on the server. So there's some advantage of doing this, wherein you can be sending that kind of content pre-rendered on your browser, and you do not need to really wait for all the React compilation, all the binding and all of that kind of stuff to show the content to the user. So in general, the rendering was happening pretty fast when you were working on the server-side rendered page. There are also some drawbacks in which you need to be going back to the Next.js server to request for additional data. So let's just see on a high level how this works. So in Next.js server, you have a traditional kind of server. Then you have your browser. Now, whenever your browser wants to display some sort of content, it requests to the server, not just a routing request or HTML, CSS request. It can also be some API request. Your Next.js server can actually host all the APIs as well. So the API server that was added over here externally can actually be internalized in the Next.js server. This concept is called as the backend for frontend, in which you are basically hosting a backend separately to send all your requests to your backend first, and then to some third-party services or your database. Now, the way Next.js behaves, making this backend for frontend concept is quite easy over here. Now, whenever you have a routing, you basically go to the Next.js server and say that, hey, I have been routed to an X page, and show me what is the kind of content or the kind of HTML that needs to be shown up over here. So this is on a very, very high level what's happening in a Next.js application. Now let's move forward and see what are the two main concepts of a Next.js server. So whenever we're going to be talking about Next.js application, we're going to be talking about client-side components and server-side components. So these are like the two very, very primary concepts that we really need to know about whenever you're building up a Next.js application. So in a Next.js server, whenever you have your browser, you're going to be running a set of client components, and a set of server components. Now let's try to understand what's the difference between a client component and a server component. The client component basically is able to run some browser specific activities. So for example, you have to be fetching, hey, what's the URL that's present currently? I want to be picking up some URL parameters or query parameters that can only be done by some client side components. Then you have the local storage access. Then you have the client side routing. The use of some special React hooks, such as the use effect hook, can only be done in the client side component. Then you also have things like the DOM access, which again can only be done by the client side components. When I say client, is basically the browser in which our application is running. Now on the other hand, we have the server components. So server component, what happens is your Next.js server is going to be rendering that entire component, a React component, and returning that entire rendered component to your front end. So the browser has to do nothing. It's just going to be picking up that rendered component and showing it on the browser. Now, what is the difference between the server and the client components? Well, on the server component, because it is running on the server, it has the capabilities of a traditional Node.js application. So in this, you can be doing something like the database access calls. You can also be running some external API request. You can be even fetching up some data related to the operating system. Or maybe you want to be picking up some environment variables that are present on your server. Or maybe you want to be writing some additional, or maybe you want to be writing some files on the server. So all those server related things are going to be done in your server component. Now you are going to be facing a lot of issues when you're working with Next.js application, where your Next.js application is going to be complaining, hey, you're trying to use a use effect, but this is a server component and you cannot be using a use effect over here. So these are like very common kind of mistakes that we're going to be facing when we're going to be developing our Next.js application. So please be aware of these two very important concepts. Let's understand another very important concept, that is the concept of server actions. Now, sometimes what happens is from the client side component, we want to be running some sort of activity or some sort of function that needs something related from the server. So for example, let's see over here, we have the server functions, which can do things like the API access, or that means the external API access. It can be doing some sort of database access or maybe some form submission. So server actions are just a fancy name, basically a simple JavaScript function that runs only on the server. It does not run on the browser, it runs only on the server. These server functions can actually be called from both client-side components and the server components. So let's say, for example, you are on a client component and you want to be fetching something from the database. Now, obviously, since your client component is running on the browser, you cannot access the database directly. So what you'll do is you'll be calling a server action for database access. So you're going to be saying, hey, I want to be fetching a list of movies and these movies are stored in my database. So I'm going to be calling a server function saying that, hey, get me all the movies that are present. So this Next.js server is going to be calling a server function. The server function is going to be hitting the database and the database is going to be returning the values, which indirectly is going to be returned to the client components. So this is how you use the server actions. We're going to be seeing a lot of it in detail, and we're going to be seeing exactly the places where we're going to be implementing this as well. But just to get a very high level concept of all of these fancy terms that are not really used when you're working on a traditional React application. So that's about it on all of the concept that we need to know so far. Let's go ahead and start creating this Next.js project, and also let me show you where you can be finding up all the resources to follow along in this particular tutorials. So I'm going to be going to my terminal. I'm using this fancy terminal called as wrap. You should check it out. You can do some natural language kind of processing on this terminal. It's pretty cool compared to the native Mac terminal. Do check it out. If you also want a tutorial on this, do drop me a message or a comment and I'll be happy to make it too. So I'm in my local folder. I'm going to be starting up a new Next.js application. So you can say over here as npx create Next.js app @latest, and over here the name of the project is Next Movies. Now you can see I didn't type a lot, and that's thanks to the terminal. So make sure that you have Node installed. I hope you really have. So I'm just going to be hitting enter and getting the bootstrap of the Next.js application. So I'm going to be running on this 14.2.13. Let's proceed. Would you like to use TypeScript? Yes. Do you use ESLint? Yes. Tailwind CSS? Yes. Do you like to use the SRC directly? I generally don't like to use it. I'm going to say as no. Would you like to use the app router? Now, this might be something confusing. So basically in Next.js, you have two types of routing logics possible. You have the app router and you have the page router. Now, app router is the newer kind of router that Next.js generally recommends. And in this entire kind of tutorials, I'm just going to be working with the app router. So just go ahead and say yes. Would you like to customize the defaults over here? So I'm saying as no, and let's wait for it to install. So let's give that a minute. Okay, so my project is now installed. Let me just open it up. So I'll go to the next movies and I'll just open up this project. Okay, so that's done. Now over here, you are going to be seeing that all the files have been structured here. Now, before we go ahead and do any fancy works and start creating that movie booking application, let's try to start off this project and see what we have got by default. So you can just open up the terminal by pressing Command J. And by the way, if you like my VS Code setup, or you want to be exploring what I have done over here, what all the plugins that I'm using, you can just check out my other video on YouTube. And in that, I've explained all the kind of things that I'm using on VS Code to help me. Okay, so here we are in the next movies. If you open up the package.json, you will be seeing some default scripts that are created. So we have one called as dev. So this runs the local development server, Next.dev. And over here, I can just say as npm run dev. So this should basically open up your server locally. And my server is now ready. So let me just open up my browser, and over here I'll go to localhost 3001. That's the place where it's running. And there you have it. You have a Next.js application actually running. You can go to the docs if you like to, but probably you won't have to. We are going to be covering a lot of it over here. Okay, so that's done. Now, a few things that I would like to talk about before we actually code. I would like to talk about the default structure that was created for us. So as you remember, we are on the app router when we had done the setup. So this creates this app folder, and within this you'll be seeing some default files that are created. There's some font files that are created for us. We have some favicon, global CSS. In global CSS, we can see that the Tailwind has automatically been imported for us, which is pretty cool. We are going to be leveraging another library for doing all the styling, and we're going to be installing that shortly. But for now, let's just see that we have this Tailwind installed. Okay, the next part and the very important part over here is the layout.tsx and the page.tsx. So what happens in Next.js is you are going to be managing the entire routing, entire rendering of the application using just folders and files. So that's how convenient it is. So you don't need to be using something like a React router, which we used to use in a traditional React application. You're just going to be maintaining everything using folders and just files. These are specially named files for Next.js. It's not just randomly created file. So this layout and page.tsx actually means something. Now layout.tsx is a parent file, and this basically nests the page.tsx. So let's try to explore what's happening over here. So on the top, we can just see some fonts are getting loaded, and that's okay. You have some metadata being added. And since this is the first file or the first layout that is going to be rendered on our application, it also has this script of HTML and body. You're not going to be finding generally this HTML body in any other layout. We can actually have multiple layouts. We'll see that again. But just remember that this is the root folder. And in the root folder in the layout.tsx, we keep our HTML and the body scripts. Now in the body script, again, some sort of classes have been added, which is okay. And we are basically passing in the children. Now, when we say children over here, what it does is it's going to be basically embedding the page.tsx over here. So automatically Next.js is like, okay, I'm just going to be picking up this page.tsx if you have mentioned. And I'm going to be basically putting up all of this content that we see on the page.tsx right into the layout. So if you want to be making some changes, it's pretty easy. Let's suppose I want to be making something over here. So let's see, what should we do? We'll say over here as deploy my app. Let's just save that. And if I just switch over to my browser, you can see over here as deploy my app. So it also supports hot reloading. So we can see that it has been updated. Okay, so that's cool. We saw how the layout and the page.tsx work. There's another important file over here called as next.config.mjs. So in here, we can be adding some additional Next.js related config. We might not be adding anything for now, but let's see if the need arises, we might add some additional configurations. Okay, so that's good. Now, if you observe one thing, we are on the route layout. Whenever you want to be adding some new routes, is quite straightforward. So as I told you, we are going to be managing everything to folders. So I can just create over here a new folder. Let's call this as movies for now. And we're going to be cleaning up this a lot. But for now, let's just try to see how it works. And over here, I'm going to be calling another page.tsx. It always has to be a page.tsx. Otherwise, this route is not going to be a valid route. Now, once you have this page.tsx, you can just export a simple component over here. So I'll say over here as export default function movies. And it gives me a lot of type completion. As you can see, I'm going to be returning movies just like that. Let's go ahead and save this. And that's pretty much it. My movies route is now created. So if I just go back to my browser and over here, if I just put up as /movies, I can see that my movies route is now hit and I see the content that we have just added over here. So that's how easy it is to be creating different routes in Next.js. Now, please note that this page.tsx is a mandatory file that you need to be creating whenever you want to be adding a new route, whereas the layout.tsx is not a mandatory file. Let's say you want to be doing some more deeply nested kind of routings, then you would be adding additional layout.tsx, but if not, it's not really required. So that's it for the introduction. So one more thing over here, I'm going to be pushing up all of this code on my Git repository. You can be finding it over here. So if you just go to gauravsoni1/next movies, you're going to be finding up this code repository, which you can clone. I'm going to be leaving up the link of this repository in the description below, and you can just get it from there. And also I'm going to be tagging all of this code. So here you can see that I've added one tag and it's called as introduction. And you can actually switch the tags over here as well. So you can just click over here. I'm going to be switching up this one introduction. And I'm going to try to follow the same naming convention that I'm going to be putting up in this YouTube video. So it's going to be very easy for you to basically switch between the tags and check out the appropriate code in case you get stuck. So once you're here, you can just go here, code, and just download this code repository. I hope you are going to be following along with me, and I'm going to be publishing a couple of videos every week, and we're going to be developing this amazing application. And by the end of this video, we're going to be getting a very good hands-on knowledge how to be creating an application in Next.js. And for that, please do subscribe and drop me a comment below so that you get a notification as soon as I publish the next part of this course.